Ah, the mirror polish, one of the holy grails of dice making, and not nearly so difficult to achieve as you might think. Stay tuned. Start off today by talking about the materials you're going to need, and I will go ahead and list them in the description for your ease as well. If you like what you see, don't forget to go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more videos. All right, first up, this is a messy process. I like to keep a container of baby wipes. These happen to be the cheapo version from Target at my desk at all times in order to contain the mess. Number 2, you need a flat surface. A lot of makers like to use glass. I have this piece of granite countertop sample that I picked up from Home Depot. I really like it because it has some heft to it and doesn't slide around when I'm working. So, glass or a marble countertop sample would be my suggestions. I also like to put my slab of granite onto a microfiber cloth. This helps catch any drippings because we will be wet sanding, and also provides a little extra anti-slip if I happen to be sitting not at my desk. Number 3, we're going to need an Exacto knife, a nice sharp one with a fresh blade. This will be used for removing flashing from our dice, and the sharper the blade, the better your control. Then you're going to need your water. You can put it in anything you want, but I do recommend having some sort of contraption for dripping the water in a controlled manner. I'm using a needleless syringe here, but you could certainly use a pipette or even your fingers if you didn't have anything else lying around. Next up, we're going to need waterproof sandpaper in either 800 or 1000 grit. Remember that the lower the grit you have, the faster it's going to cut through the resin, so it'll go faster, but you'll also have less control. So if you're nervous, go for the 1000 over the 800. I use 800 at this point in my practice. Next up, we have our Zona polishing papers. If you have spent any time in the dice making community, you know these are kind of the holy grail. They're not incredibly expensive. These are 10 packs that I think run about $20 a piece, and I can get out of one sheet anywhere from 6 to maybe 7 or 8 sets of dice, depending on how much work I have to do. These are flexible papers as opposed to the harder stuff that is the wet dry sandpaper, and that's why they get such a good polish, which we'll talk about later. All right, now let's talk about your process. These are dice raw from my mold, and you can see they're really not bad. They have a pretty good shine already and not a whole lot that needs to be done. The main thing I have to deal with are raised faces, but this leads me to tip number 1, and that is that you need to spend as much time on your masters as you can, because more time spent on your masters and getting them really well polished equals less time spent finishing your dice later. So these are my masters from Arcana Cast, and this video is from the night I finished polishing them, so you can see they're crystal clear with a very good polish. And just remember, when you make your molds, whatever level of polish that you have on your masters is what you're going to get out of your dice. So spend a little extra time here rather than later. Step 1, we're going to go ahead and remove the flashing from our dice. These are the little pieces of resin that are left over around where the lid or the sprue were sitting. And the goal here is not to get a perfectly smooth angle. You're not going to get that with an Exacto knife. It's just to get enough off so that you don't have to spend so much time sanding and ruin your finish too much. So I like to use the Crystal D4 as an example because there's always this little tiny ledge because I use a cap mold. There's really nothing you can do about it. It's just the nature of cap molds and Crystal D4s. But you can see I'm using the Exacto knife to very carefully, very slowly get rid of that ledge and match the angle of the points. All right, I'm not trying to get it perfect. Please note that. The other one I like to show always is the D10 or D% because they have very tricky angles. And they are very prone, depending on how you set up your keys, to raised faces. So I'm, again, very, very carefully, very gently, kind of whittling away the resin with the Exacto knife. I'm not trying to make deep cuts. I'm not trying to go quickly. Again, this is just kind of the prep work to get everything ready for the next stage of the process. All right, once we removed the flashing, we're going to go ahead and level our faces and shape the dice in any way that need to. So for example, if you have a void or something you need to correct, you'll spend more time at this point. Since I don't have much to correct, I know that most of my work is going to be done on the gray Zona paper, which is 15 microns. So my first recommendation for you here, tip number 2, is to stabilize your work surface. If you have to worry about your paper sliding everywhere, you're never going to get a good polish. So I'm going to go ahead and put some water on my work surface, and that will create just kind of a mild suction or adhesion for the Zona paper. This part is really not very precise, as you can see by the fact that water is going everywhere, but it is very useful. All right, so at this point I've removed the flashing, and for my dice I really only need to do work anywhere that I had that raised face. So for example, take a look here on this D12. You can see I pointed out where the raised face was and I leveled it. We have a little bit of an irregularity. The 15 micron Zona paper is a really good way to try to get rid of that, because it's coarse enough that you're still going to get some cutting and correction, but it allows you to go really slow and really controlled, and that ultimately will result in a better product. Honestly, the less time you can spend on those heavier grits like the 800,000 and the 15 micron, the less work you're going to have to do later on with polishing. So with the gray Zona paper, I am only working on the faces that were impacted by my removal of the flashing. That's it. I'm not touching any of the faces that were already good to go. So I'm trying to show you in this shot, and it's a little hard to see that I'm really just going on the gray Zona until I get 2 things done. One is that I blend in that edge where I remove the flashing, but the other thing is I am going to go until I get a nice even surface. And that's really the key to all sandpaper use on any project, is you're not done with a grit until you have no more scratches visible. And that's just because of the nature of how sandpaper works. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit more later. But right now, we get to our tip number 3, which is always think about your angles. Part of the beauty of polyhedral dice is the intricate angles that all of the faces form, right? That's why we all like those alternative shapes so much. So when you're sanding, always be thinking about the angle of the face you're working on and keeping that angle flush with your hard work surface. This hard work surface will prevent you from rounding your edges if you're working on sharp edge dice, and keep you from messing up your angles. So here we go. I'm trying to speed through this a little bit because, let's face it, no one wants to watch hours and hours of footage of me working on sandpaper. So we'll speed through some parts of this. All right. At this point, we got to the end of the D12, and I'm now working on the D20. Now, because this is an older mold set that I was working out of, I have a little bit more work to do, especially with the D20, because the faces in my molds tend to raise more and more the older the mold gets. So here I am working on the D20. And here again with the D20, the same as with the D12, we're looking for a nice evenness. We're looking to blend those raised edges that I tried to start the correction of with the Exacto knife. However, unlike with the D12, with the D20, the 15 micron gray Zona paper is not quite sufficient. So the first thing I did was make sure that I had a nice even cut with my Exacto knife, because I didn't really from the first one. And for me personally, this tends to happen with the D20 just because I get impatient, and I also get nervous about it being overdone because it's such an important die. So I go ahead and try again with the 15 gray Zona paper, and this is you getting to see me troubleshoot my sanding and polishing in real time. So we're trying to troubleshoot here, and we'll see what happens. And you're going to see rather quickly that this is just not going to cut it. So we're going to have to use something a little heavier. And unfortunately, I was not quite ready to give up on the gray Zona paper. I really prefer to avoid anything lower than that gray Zona if at all possible, just because it's harder to polish something that you've done on a lower grit. So let's see at what point I go ahead and give up on the gray Zona paper. While we're waiting for me to go give up on the gray Zona, let me just say how sandpaper works. So basically, sandpaper is controlled scratches that you are applying to remove material from your surface, right? That is what sandpaper is. And that's the reason why if you see scratches, you are not done with that grit yet, because you haven't removed an even amount yet. All right, so at this point, I go ahead and resign myself to the fact that I'm going to need to use that 800 grit sandpaper. Now with 800 grit, you need to go really slow. Tip number 4 from me to you is to go as slow as possible on lower grits. Anything 1,000 and lower, you should be going very slow, because it's going to remove resin at a rate faster than you would expect. So you see, I am making very sure that I am keeping the die completely flush with my surface so that I am maintaining my angles. And every now and then I'm turning it so that I go in a different direction, so that I don't end up with those scratches from the sandpaper all in one. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward here, but you can see even fast forwarding, I am going fairly slow, and I'm only going enough to achieve that blending I want from one face to the other at the angle, right? And then I'm returning to the gray Zona paper to go ahead and smooth that out. So the 800, we're making fairly large scratches in the surface, and we scratch and scratch until it's down to where we want. With the 15 micron Zona, we're doing the same thing, but at a much smaller, more microscopic scale. And that's really what happens as you sand. You move from lower grit to higher grit, and the higher the grit, the finer and closer together the scratches are that you're making in your surface, until they become so small that the human eye can't perceive them, at which point you have a polished finish. And that's basically the whole goal of sanding. So with that in mind, that's why I spend as little time as humanly possible on those lower grits with dice. All right, so at this point, I decided I was fairly happy with that. I realized that this face in particular was just too lifted for me to get it down to perfection. If I had tried to go that far, I might have lost that number 1 because, it's only so deep. So there is a point at which you have to weigh with raised faces. Do I keep going and make it perfect, or do I leave it playable and just give a disclaimer in my sales post or to whomever I'm gifting the dice to? All right. So we finish out with the gray Zona here, and we just go until it's smooth. And this is just a reiteration. Tip number 5, you're not done with a grit until those scratches are smoothed out. And it's not really that you're smoothing them out, it's just that you're creating them uniformly enough that there aren't any specifically sticking around or visible to the human eye. Step 3 is where we actually begin the polishing. And here's where we start using the Zona. I use 3 micron Zona to start. It's the pink color. And I set up my block the same as I did for the gray Zona. It's the same way. I'm going to do it for every single one. And with the pink Zona, what I'm actually going to do is pay special attention to any of the die faces that I spent time with the gray Zona on and get them up to the same amount of polish as the rest of the die. So what I have found is that my dice come out raw at about the level of the 2 micron blue Zona. So I use the pink to really kind of even out all the sides, get them all back to the same shine before I go on to the final polish. So again, pink Zona at 2 microns in diameter. So the reason we say 2 micron is that's how big the particles are that are actually embedded in the sandpaper. Tip 6, you want to use light pressure with higher grits. So whereas we needed a nice steady pressure and fairly firm with the lower grits, with our higher grits we want to be barely pushing down, just enough for us to keep the dice in contact with the paper. You also want to move fairly quickly, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. But with the pink is where you really need to start doing that nice light. So you can see now that one face was completely matte and frosted, and now it's starting to return to a nice shine. And that's the whole goal with the pink, is to take those signs that you've mattified and get them shiny again. Tip number 7 is that you should polish by look and feel rather than by a particular method. I have heard a lot of dice makers who swear by, doing 10 circles this way, 10 that way, and then back and forth, and they have these formulas. And none of those have really worked for me. Not to say that they don't work for anyone, just that for me, it's much easier because from day to day with the humidity and the heat and the different materials I use to color them, my dice are a little bit different. And so I ultimately judge based on the feel first and foremost. So at the point where your scratches become uniform from that sandpaper, the dice starts to glide instead of drag. And it's a very specific feeling that you can feel if you have that nice light, steady pressure. And that's something you learn with experience. So until you get experienced, you just need to keep checking your face and see. Tip number 8, for higher numbered dice, you need to set a pattern for polishing the sides so you don't lose track. Of course, the D20 is the one we all worry about the most, and here's how I do it. I treat from the 20 around the top as a top crown, so to speak, and I go around. And then again on the bottom crown from 1, then 19, 3, 17, and 7, I treat that as another crown. And I treat those as cones, and I rotate through them. Then you're left with a middle band. And I go through all those middle numbers and I just work my way around and I make note of which one I start with. I usually start with either the 1 or the 20 face facing up. So that's my tip for dealing with the D20. At this point, it's time to move on to the 2 micron blue Zona paper. And this is my favorite because this is where we finally start to see that mirror finish start to come out. So here I'm going to use the D6 because it's got nice broad sides that were easier to capture on camera and show you the actual results. So again, nice light pressure going very quickly. And here you really want to pay attention to when you start to feel that glide that I described. And you really want to get as close to perfection as you can. Really keep going with the blue until you see basically no scratches left. And if you continue to get more scratches, you're probably pushing too hard. You're probably applying too much pressure. So think about that as you're going through and trying to troubleshoot. The blue Zona also is the first one that I use on all faces, regardless of what I've previously done. So on this D6, every single face is going to get hit with the blue Zona paper, and that's true for every die. Once I've gone through every face with the blue Zona and I'm happy, now it's time to ink. I just use a narrow brush that I got from Michael's, and I use some very basic acrylic paint from a tube. What I'm using to wipe off is actually those unscented baby wipes that I showed at the very beginning. For me, it's the El Cheapo Target brand, Up&Up, and they work quite well. So have those on hand. I just find they work a little better than a paper towel or a fingertip as far as how much smudging is left behind. That being said, you're always going to have a little smudging left behind, which I'm going to talk about how I deal with that next. But you want to make sure every surface of that number is covered inside and out, and it's nice and thick. You may have to do more than one coat depending on your paint. So step 5 is the final polish, and you'll make note that this comes after I have done the inking. And the reason for this is once you hit the blue and white Zona papers, they're not really going to leave any junk in your numbers anymore. And so it's really easy for me to go back and use these papers as a means to get the ink off any smudging, like what I'm showing you here, as well as get that final polish. So that's my tip number 9. Use the pattern of polish, ink, polish. So blue Zona, ink, back to blue Zona, and then white. That's the pattern that I recommend. I'm also switching to isopropyl alcohol here instead of water for my wet sanding because it does a little bit easier job of getting that paint off. And it just goes a little bit faster. And let's face it, I'm an impatient person, and this is for most people one of their least favorite parts of dice making. I actually enjoy it. I find it kind of meditative, but so I'm just showing you the before. This is what my faces looked like after inking. You can see there's some smudges. And I'm going to go ahead and use really, really light pressure and just a couple circles on the blue Zona with that alcohol. and you'll be amazed at how quickly and cleanly it cleans up that face. So let me show you now. Yeah, look at that beautiful shine. All right, so at this point, all of the dice have been through the blue Zona with alcohol, and you can see they look pretty darn good. You could honestly stop here if you wanted to, but at the end of the day, I am a perfectionist, so I'm gonna go all the way down to the 1 micron white Zona. So again, we're preparing the surface the same way with water to adhere it to the sanding block. And this is my favorite part because, oh my gosh, that feeling when you get that perfect shine is just amazing. So go ahead and wet it down, and we're going to go through every face just like we did with the blue Zonas because this is our final polish. I really take my time on the white because it's my favorite. So tip number 10, and my last tip for you, is for your final polish, move really fast and really light. You know, barely do just enough pressure to keep the dice from shifting around, keep it in contact with the paper, but move really quickly, really lightly, and the results are just going to be amazing. And again, just like with the blue, there is a change of feeling. It's not quite as pronounced. There's a change from a bit of a drag to a glide when you're really close to being done. So you can kind of use that. Again, I'm going to speed through, and you can already see that shine. But I'm going to speed through this because no one wants to sit and watch me do circles on sandpaper for an hour. And so at this point, I just go through all of the faces of my D4, including the ends of the points, which those of you who do crystal D4s know is kind of a pain, but I think it's well worth it because I love the shape. I find that I like to put on Critical Role to listen to or something else to stay relaxed while I'm polishing dice, just because the tenser you are, the more likely you are to have uneven pressure and the less fine of a finish you get. So find a way to relax while you do this. Highly recommend it. I believe I was listening to Critical Role while I did this set. No spoilers, I'm still in the first half of season 1. Don't judge me. I was a sheltered child. But I'm sure loving it now. All right, so let's just show off those final results. Look at that shine. And this is the lowest tech way you could possibly do this. You know, it's very cheap to start with as opposed to buying a tumbler or a Dremel or any other supplies. So let's have a look at those final dice. Helpful for some of you. If you want more tips and tricks, please like this video, share it, and subscribe if you want updates. You can also support me on Ko-fi, and I hope you all have a wonderful, happy dicing.